The Grand Assembly Hall floated in the darkness of space like a frozen tear. It was made of crystal that had been grown over 10,000 years, and light from distant stars passed through its walls, creating rainbows that shifted across the floor like living things. Representatives from 47 species sat in their designated areas, each section designed for their specific biology. Some breathed methane, some required water, some existed as pure energy contained in special chambers. And in a small corner, barely noticed by anyone, sat the human delegation. Ambassador Elena Vasquez was 71 years old. Her hair was silver and pulled back in a simple style. Her face carried lines from decades of smiling and frowning and everything in between. She wore a plain dark suit because humans had learned long ago that simplicity spoke louder than decoration. Beside her sat two aides who looked nervous. They had every reason to be. High above the assembly floor, in the observation deck reserved for military personnel, Captain Marcus Webb watched the proceedings with his hands clasped behind his back. He was 48 years old, with a soldier's posture and a diplomat's patience. His uniform was crisp and clean, decorated with medals he never talked about. Beside him stood Lieutenant Sarah Chen, his second in command. She was 32, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a temper she constantly struggled to control. "They're going to humiliate us," Chen whispered. "Probably," Webb replied quietly. "Watch and learn." The Vellery delegation occupied the center of the hall, as they always did. They were massive creatures standing 3 meters tall, with 6 limbs covered in hard plates of natural armor. Their heads were angular, with compound eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not imagine. They had ruled the galactic core for 12,000 years. They had destroyed civilizations older than human writing. High Arbiter Thalos rose to speak. His voice was translated through the universal system, turning clicks and hisses into words everyone could understand. "Honored members of the Galactic Council," Thalos began. "We gather today to discuss the matter of the species known as humans. They have requested membership in our great assembly. They wish to be recognized as equals." Laughter rippled through the hall. It came in many forms, from many throats and communication organs, but the meaning was universal. Thalos raised one of his forearms for silence. "Let us examine the evidence of their worthiness." A holographic display appeared in the center of the hall. It showed Earth, a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. "Their home world," Thalos said with obvious disgust. "No natural defenses. No poisonous atmosphere. No extreme temperatures. Their planet is so hospitable that it practically invites conquest." The display changed to show human beings walking, talking, living their small lives. "Their bodies are soft. They have no natural armor, no claws worth mentioning, no venom. A Vellery child could kill an adult human with minimal effort." More laughter. "They require constant sustenance. They must eat multiple times per day or they begin to weaken. They must sleep for a third of their existence or their minds fail. They are slaves to their own biology." The display showed human lifespans compared to other species. The bar representing humanity was embarrassingly short. They live for less than a single century. By the time a human has learned anything of value, they die. Their greatest minds barely have time to form a complete thought before age claims them. Thalos paused, letting the data sink in. Then he delivered his final point. "They have no psychic abilities. They cannot communicate through thought. They cannot sense danger before it arrives. They are deaf and blind to the forces that govern the universe." He turned to face Ambassador Vasquez directly. His compound eyes reflected her small figure 1,000 times. "These creatures have been among the stars for only 200 years. 200 years. Some of us in this chamber remember when their ancestors were still hitting each other with sticks and calling it war." The laughter was louder now. Cruel. Ambassador Vasquez sat perfectly still, her expression revealing nothing. "The Vellery Empire proposes the following," Thalos announced. "Humanity is clearly unfit for membership in the Galactic Council. They are a young species, a weak species, a species that requires guidance and protection. We propose that Earth and all human territories be designated as a Vellery protectorate." In the observation deck, Lieutenant Chen's hands curled into fists. "Protectorate," she whispered. "That's a fancy word for property." Captain Webb said nothing. His eyes were fixed on Ambassador Vasquez. Under our protection, Thalos continued, humans will be cared for. Their resources will be managed responsibly. Their population will be maintained at sustainable levels. They should be grateful that we offer protection rather than extinction. Several council members nodded in agreement. The Velari had been making species disappear for millennia. This was considered mercy. We call for an immediate vote, Thalos declared. The voting was quick. Species after species sided with the Velari, either out of agreement or out of fear. When it was finished, the result was 44 in favor, 2 abstaining, and 1 opposed. The single opposing vote came from a species called the Mulgari, aquatic beings who had themselves been conquered by the Velari long ago. The motion passes, the council moderator announced. Earth and all human territories are hereby classified as harvestable resources under Velari protection. The human delegation may now speak if they wish to express gratitude. Every eye, every sensor, every attention-focusing organ in the hall turned to Ambassador Vasquez. She rose slowly. Her movements were calm and measured. She looked around the vast chamber at species that had decided her people's fate without asking them. And she smiled. It was not a happy smile. "High Arbiter Thalos," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You have presented much evidence about human weakness. You are correct about many things. We are soft. We are short-lived. We are limited in ways that most species here would consider fatal flaws." Thalos made a gesture that meant satisfaction. "You accept your designation?" "I accept nothing," Ambassador Vasquez replied. "I simply acknowledge the facts as you have presented them. But you have made one critical error in your analysis." The hall grew quiet. This was not how conquered species were supposed to respond. "You see our short lives as weakness," the ambassador continued. "We see them as urgency. We do not have millennia to accomplish our goals, so we accomplish them in decades. You see our soft bodies as vulnerability. We see them as motivation. We learned long ago that the universe wants to kill us, so we learned to kill it back." Thalos made a sharp clicking sound. Childish defiance. "Perhaps," Ambassador Vasquez said. "But let me leave you with something to consider. On our home world, we have a saying. A cornered animal is the most dangerous animal. You have just cornered 8 billion of us." She gathered her materials and turned to leave. "You misunderstand what weakness means, High Arbiter. You will learn. I suspect the lesson will be painful." As she walked toward the exit, every translator in the hall conveyed her final words clearly to every species present. In the observation deck, Lieutenant Chen's communicator buzzed. She checked the encrypted message, and her face went pale. "Sir," she said to Captain Webb, "Earth Command has responded to the Council's vote." She swallowed hard. "They've authorized Protocol Crimson." Captain Webb closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had changed in his expression. The diplomat was gone. The soldier had returned. "Signal the Eternal Dawn," he said quietly. "Tell them to prepare for departure. And tell them to load the war package." "Sir, are we really going to?" "The Velari just declared 8 billion humans to be property. They called our children harvestable resources. They laughed while doing it." He turned away from the observation window, away from the crystal hall where species were already celebrating humanity's subjugation. They wanted to see what humans do when pushed to the edge. He walked toward the exit, Lieutenant Chen falling into step behind him. New Bison was a small world on the outer edge of human space. It had been colonized 40 years ago by families looking for new opportunities and fresh starts. The planet had rolling hills covered in blue grass, oceans that sparkled purple under twin suns, and cities built with the practical beauty that humans carried with them wherever they went. 40,000 people called it home. The Velari fleet arrived 18 hours after the council vote. Commander Ji-un Park stood on the roof of the Colonial Administration Building and watched the sky fill with enemy ships. She was 34 years old, born on Earth but raised among the stars. Her parents had been farmers. Her grandparents had survived the Seoul collapse, the terrible earthquake that had destroyed half of Korea a century ago. She had their stubbornness in her blood. 200 warships hung in the sky like metal clouds. Each one was larger than any vessel humanity had ever built. Their weapons could turn cities to glass in seconds. Their shields could stop anything the colonial garrison could throw at them. Ji-Un's defense force consisted of 800 soldiers, 20 atmospheric fighters, and a population of civilians who had never seen war. Her communication officer ran up to her, out of breath. "Commander, the Velari are broadcasting. Put it through." The alien voice filled the air, translated into cold, emotionless words. "Human colony designated New Bison. You have 1 hour to surrender all personnel and resources. Resistance will result in complete cleansing. This is not a negotiation. This is a notification." The communication ended. Silence fell over the city. Ji-Un looked at her soldiers. They were scared. Of course they were scared. Only fools faced death without fear. But underneath the fear, she saw something else. She saw anger. "Get me a broadcast channel," she said. "All frequencies. I want those creatures to hear this." The officer worked quickly. "Channel open, Commander." Ji-Un took a deep breath. She thought of her grandmother, who had pulled survivors from rubble with bleeding hands. She thought of her mother, who had helped rebuild a nation brick by brick. She thought of every human who had ever refused to give up. "Velari Fleet," she said, her voice steady. "This is Commander Ji-Un Park of the New Bison Colonial Defense Force. My grandmother survived the Sol collapse. My mother rebuilt our nation with her bare hands. I will not surrender a single child to creatures who call us weak. If you want this planet, come and take it. But understand this, you will pay for every inch of ground in blood." She cut the transmission. Her soldiers stared at her in shock. Some looked terrified. Others looked proud. One young private actually smiled. "Commander," the communication officer said quietly, "they outnumber us 250 to 1. "I can count," Ji-Un replied. "Now get everyone armed. Civilians, too. If they can hold a weapon, they fight." The hour passed quickly. When it ended, the Velari began their assault. The first wave of landing craft descended like metal rain. They expected no resistance. They expected the humans to kneel and accept their fate, like every other species had done before them. They were wrong. The colonial fighters struck first, diving from high atmosphere with weapons blazing. They destroyed 7 landing craft before Velari interceptors overwhelmed them. 18 pilots died in the first 3 minutes. Their final transmissions were not screams of fear. They were battle cries. Ground defenses opened fire as the remaining landing craft touched down. Human soldiers poured from buildings and trenches, hitting the enemy with everything they had. The weapons were inferior. The armor was weaker. The numbers were hopeless. None of that mattered. Private Yuna Kim was 19 years old. She had been a student before the invasion, studying biology and dreaming of discovering new alien life forms. Now she crouched behind a burning vehicle, firing at Velari soldiers twice her size. A grenade landed near her position. Without thinking, she grabbed it and threw it back. It exploded against a Velari warrior, sending pieces of alien armor flying. "Did you see that?" she shouted to nobody in particular. "I got one." Beside her, Sergeant Min-Jun Kong, a veteran of 30 years, shook his head in amazement. "Crazy kid. Stay down and keep shooting." Across the city, similar scenes played out. Humans died by the dozens, but they took Velari with them. A group of miners used drilling equipment to collapse a building on an enemy squad. Teachers organized evacuation routes while carrying weapons they had never trained with. A retired grandmother drove a cargo vehicle directly into a Velari command post, destroying it completely. The Velari had expected surrender. They got war. Commander Ji-Un coordinated the defense from a mobile command post, staying one step ahead of enemy strikes. She had no hope of winning. She knew that. But she could make them bleed. She could make them remember that humans were not prey. Hours passed. The colonial forces were pushed back again and again. Casualties mounted. But still they fought. Then the eternal dawn arrived. Captain Marcus Webb had pushed his ship's engines beyond their safety limits to reach New Bison in time. His vessel was a diplomatic cruiser, not a warship. It carried minimal weapons and thin armor. Against 200 Vellery ships, it should have been meaningless. But Webb did not come to fight ships. He came to fight the idea that humans would submit. "Lieutenant Chen," he ordered, "broadcast on all frequencies. I want every species in the galaxy to see what happens here today." Chen nodded and activated the ship's communication array. Across 1,000 light-years, viewers tuned in to watch the Battle of New Bison. "Sergeant Major Beck," Webb continued, "prepare your Marines for boarding action." Sergeant Major De-Jong Beck was a mountain of muscle and scars. He had fought in every conflict humanity had faced since first contact. His team consisted of 12 Marines, the finest soldiers the Eternal Dawn carried. "Captain," Beck said slowly, "you want us to board a Vellery command ship with 12 people? I want you to take a Vellery command ship with 12 people." Beck stared at his captain for a long moment. Then he smiled, an expression that had terrified enemies across dozens of worlds. "Understood, sir. We'll leave the light on for you." The Marine shuttle launched from the Eternal Dawn while Vellery attention was focused on the ground battle. It approached the enemy command vessel from an unexpected angle, using the planet's magnetic field to mask its signature. Beck and his team breached the hull in a section the Vellery considered secure. They were wrong. What followed was not a battle. It was a statement. 12 humans moved through a ship designed for creatures twice their size. They used their smaller bodies to navigate spaces the Vellery could not follow. They set traps using enemy equipment. They killed without mercy and without hesitation. The Vellery crew numbered over 3,000. Within an hour, Beck's team had reached the bridge. The ship's commander stared at the blood-soaked humans with something no Vellery had felt in millennia: fear. "Impossible," he clicked. "You are weak. You are soft. You cannot." Beck shot him before he could finish. "We're not soft," the sergeant major said, his voice transmitted across the galaxy for all to hear. "We're motivated." The captured command ship's weapons turned against the Vellery fleet. 47 enemy vessels were destroyed before the remaining ships retreated from New Bison. On the ground, Commander Ji-Un watched the enemy withdrawal with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of relief, tears of grief for everyone she had lost, and tears of pride for everyone who had refused to surrender. The galaxy watched in silence. Species who had dismissed humanity as vermin saw something new that day. They saw creatures who should have lost but refused to accept defeat. They saw soldiers who died with curses on their lips instead of pleas for mercy. In the Grand Assembly Hall, High Arbiter Thalos received reports of the battle with growing disbelief. He demanded explanations. His advisors had none. Ambassador Vasquez requested an emergency session of the Galactic Council. When asked what humanity wanted, she smiled with the same cold expression she had worn during their humiliation. "An apology would be a good start," she said. "Your unconditional surrender will be the end." The galaxy had just witnessed something it would never forget. The moment humanity stopped asking for permission and started demanding respect. The fire that would consume an empire had been lit, and it was only beginning to spread. 1 month after New Bison, the galaxy began to understand what it had awakened. Admiral Sung-Ho Kim stood before the combined human fleet in the staging area above Earth. He was 73 years old, with white hair and hands that shook slightly from age, but his mind was sharp as a blade, and his eyes held the weight of every war humanity had ever fought. The fleet behind him was small by galactic standards, 300 ships of various sizes, most of them converted civilian vessels armed with whatever weapons could be attached. Against the Vellery Empire's 10,000 warships, it was laughable. But Admiral Kim was not laughing. He was planning. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed his commanders through the fleet-wide channel. "The Vellery believe this war is already won. They believe we are surrounded, outnumbered, and outmatched. They are correct on all 3 counts." He paused, letting the words sink in. "They are also fools, because they do not understand what we are." The display behind him showed Earth, millions of years ago. A group of primitive humans chased a large animal across an open plain. Our ancestors were not the fastest creatures on our world. They were not the strongest. They had no claws, no fangs, no armor. But they had something no other species possessed: patience. They would chase prey for days, not hours, days. They would follow until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. Too tired to run anymore. The display changed, showing human explorers crossing frozen wastelands, climbing impossible mountains, sailing across endless oceans. We are persistent predators. We do not win through single moments of strength. We win by never, ever stopping. The Velari have started a race they cannot finish, because we will still be chasing them when their empire is dust. The commanders cheered. It was the sound of people who had decided that death was preferable to surrender. Far from Earth, Lieutenant Hai-Jin Lee led her squad through underground tunnels on a Velari mining colony. She was 26 years old. 6 weeks ago, she had been a music teacher on New Bison, showing children how to play traditional instruments and sing old songs. Now she was a killer. Her squad consisted of 8 soldiers and 12 former civilians. They called themselves the Ghost Cats, after an old Earth legend about spirits that haunted those who committed evil. They had been operating behind enemy lines for 3 weeks, striking targets and vanishing before the Velari could respond. "Contact ahead," whispered Corporal Sung-Ho Park, her second in command. He was a former farmer who had learned to shoot when the Velari burned his fields. Through her optical scope, Hai-Jin could see a Velari patrol guarding a power station. 6 warriors, all armed with plasma weapons that could vaporize a human instantly. "We take the station," she said quietly. "Sung-Ho, take your team left. Draw their fire. Everyone else, follow me." The attack was quick and brutal. Sung-Ho's team opened fire from the left, pulling the Velari's attention. While the enemy focused on the distraction, Hai-Jin's team struck from behind. In 30 seconds, all 6 warriors were dead. "Set the charges," Hai-Jin ordered. "We have 4 minutes before reinforcements arrive." As her squad worked, she thought about her students on New Bison. Many had died in the attack. The survivors had been taken to Velari processing centers, their fates unknown. Every target she destroyed, every enemy she killed, was for them. The power station exploded behind them as they escaped into the tunnels. It was the 17th facility they had destroyed this week. Across the galaxy, similar stories played out. Human guerrilla forces appeared on dozens of Velari worlds, striking targets that should have been unreachable. They sabotaged supply lines, assassinated commanders, and freed prisoners from labor camps. The Velari could not understand how it was happening. Humans needed sleep. Humans needed food. Humans were supposed to collapse under pressure. Instead, they seemed to grow stronger. Dr. Mina Shin worked in her laboratory aboard the Eternal Dawn, surrounded by biological samples and holographic displays. She was 41 years old, with messy hair and dark circles under her eyes from too many sleepless nights. But her mind was racing with discovery. "Captain Webb," she called through the intercom. "I need you to see this." Webb arrived minutes later, his uniform showing the wear of constant combat operations. "What have you found, Doctor?" Mina pointed to a display showing Velari physiology. "Their biology is remarkable. Superior to ours in almost every way. Stronger muscles, harder skin, better senses, longer lifespan." "I'm aware of our disadvantages," Webb said dryly. "But they have a weakness." Mina zoomed in on a specific organ in the Velari chest. "This is their respiratory filter. It processes their atmosphere and removes toxins. Very efficient. But it requires specific conditions to function properly." She pulled up another display. Velari cannot operate effectively in environments with more than 40% oxygen. Their filters become overloaded. They become slow, confused, eventually unconscious. Webb stared at the data. Earth's atmosphere is 21% oxygen. "Yes. But we can survive in much higher concentrations, up to 50% with minimal effects." Mina smiled grimly. "We can literally breathe them to death." This discovery changed everything. Human forces began targeting Velari environmental systems. They pumped oxygen into enemy ships and installations. They released atmospheric bombs that the Velari could not survive, but humans could. The hunters became the hunted. In the Galactic Council chambers, the mood had shifted. Species that had laughed at humanity now watched the war reports with growing unease. The Velari were losing, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. Their supply lines were crumbling. Their soldiers were demoralized. Their empire was bleeding. A representative from the Mulgari, the aquatic species who had voted against human subjugation, rose to speak. "Honored members," she said, her voice translated from bubbles and whistles. "My people have lived under Velari rule for 800 years. We have watched them crush every species that opposed them. We accepted that resistance was impossible." She turned to face the Velari delegation, who sat in uncomfortable silence. "The humans have shown us that we were wrong. They have shown all of us that tyranny only survives when the oppressed believe they cannot win." She paused, her large eyes reflecting the chamber lights. "The Mulgari formally declare support for humanity. We offer our fleets, our resources, and our warriors to the human cause." Silence filled the hall. Then, slowly, other species began to stand. The Thornox, a plant-based civilization conquered centuries ago. The Kathir, insectoid beings who had been used as slave labor. The Venari, energy creatures who had been imprisoned in containment fields for generations. One by one, the oppressed nations of the galaxy rose to join humanity's war. High Arbiter Thelos watched his empire crumbling around him. He sent transmission after transmission to his fleet commanders, demanding victories that never came. He ordered genocides of rebellious populations, but his soldiers no longer had the strength to carry them out. In his private chambers, he reviewed the historical records of humanity that his analysts had dismissed as primitive propaganda. He watched footage of humans climbing mountains that served no purpose except to prove they could. He saw them crossing frozen deserts where nothing lived, simply to reach the other side. He observed them rebuilding cities that had been reduced to rubble, not once, but dozens of times throughout their history. And he finally understood what he had unleashed. Humans did not fight because they expected to win. They fought because fighting was all they knew how to do. They had evolved on a world that tried to kill them every day. And they had responded by becoming impossible to destroy. "What have we done?" Thelos whispered to an empty room. Across the galaxy, Lieutenant Hygiene Lee received a promotion to captain. The Ghost Cats had grown to 300 fighters, recruited from liberated prisoners and rebel populations. They had destroyed more Velari infrastructure than some entire fleets. When asked about her success, Hygiene thought of her students, of the songs they would never sing again. "They took everything from us," she said simply. "Now we take everything from them." The fire was spreading, and it would not stop until the galaxy was transformed. 3 months into the war, the Velari Empire was dying. High Queen Seraphine sat upon her throne on Keth Prime, the capital world of an empire that had lasted 12,000 years. The throne was carved from the bones of extinct species, a monument to Velari supremacy. Now it felt cold and hollow. Reports poured in from every corner of her domain. Fleet destroyed at Sector 7. Industrial complex captured at the Corvin Nebula. Rebellion spreading through the outer colonies. Supply lines severed. Communications disrupted. Commanders surrendering rather than fighting. All because of creatures who lived less than a century and bruised when you touched them. "Explain this to me," Seraphine demanded of her advisors. "We outnumber them 1,000 to 1. Our technology is superior. Our warriors are stronger. How are we losing?" Her chief military strategist, a scarred veteran named Vorth, stepped forward reluctantly. "Majesty, the humans do not fight as other species fight. They do not seek decisive battles. They strike at our weaknesses, our supply lines, our morale, our will to continue. When we send forces to crush them, they vanish. When we withdraw, they return. Then they burn more. Turn their planets to glass," Seraphine shouted. "End them." "We have tried, Majesty." Vorth lowered his head. "For every world we destroy, they take 3 of ours. Their guerrilla forces are everywhere. The species we have conquered for millennia are rising against us. The humans have given them hope." Hope. Such a small word. Such a devastating weapon. Far from Keth Prime, Commander Yuna Song led the Ghost Fleet through the darkness between stars. Her ships were old, patched together from salvage and captured vessels. Her crews were volunteers who had signed away their lives when they joined her command. They called themselves the Ghost Fleet because they were already dead. They just hadn't stopped fighting yet. Yuna was 45 years old, with gray streaks in her black hair and scars on her hands from a lifetime of combat. Before the war, she had commanded a research vessel. Now she commanded the most feared strike force in the galaxy. Target confirmed, her sensor officer reported. Vellery Industrial World, Keth, 7. Orbital defenses minimal. Ground forces depleted. Yuna studied the holographic display. Keth, 7 produced 70% of the Empire's fuel cells. Destroying it would cripple their fleet operations for months. Taking it intact would give those same resources to humanity. "We're not going to destroy it," she announced. "We're going to take it." Her officers exchanged glances. Taking a fortified world with the Ghost Fleet's limited forces should have been impossible. But they had learned that impossible was just a word the Vellery used to feel safe. All ships, prepare for orbital insertion. Marine teams, ready for ground assault. Today, we stop burning what we can use. Yuna allowed herself a thin smile. Let's go steal an empire. The battle for Keth, 7 lasted 6 hours. The Ghost Fleet struck like a storm, overwhelming orbital platforms before the defenders could organize. Human Marines descended in drop pods, landing directly on military installations and seizing them before reinforcements could arrive. The Vellery garrison commander broadcast a demand for surrender. Yuna responded by capturing his command bunker and sending a message to every enemy soldier on the planet. Lay down your weapons and you will be treated fairly. Fight, and you will wish you had surrendered. By nightfall, Keth, 7 belonged to humanity. On the other side of the galaxy, Captain Marcus Webb led an assault that would break the Vellery spirit forever. The Council fleet was the pride of the Vellery Empire, 5,000 warships that had never known defeat. They guarded Keth Prime itself, the last line of defense for the heart of an empire. Intelligence suggested they were preparing a final offensive to crush humanity once and for all. Webb's fleet numbered 300 ships. The math was impossible. "Sir," Lieutenant Chen said quietly, "are we really doing this?" Webb stood at the bridge viewport, watching his fleet assemble. Behind him, Dr. Mina Shin worked at a console, preparing something she called the package. "They expect us to wait," Webb replied. "They expect us to defend. They expect us to act like prey." He turned to face his crew. "We are not prey. We never were." The attack began at dawn, Keth Prime time. 300 human ships jumped into the heart of Vellery space, directly into the path of 5,000 enemy vessels. The Vellery commanders laughed when they saw the odds. Finally, the humans had made a mistake. Finally, this annoying war would end. Then the human ships began transmitting. Every vessel in Webb's fleet broadcast the same message, translated into every language in the galaxy. It showed footage from New Bison, from Keth, 7, from 100 other battles. It showed humans refusing to surrender, refusing to die, refusing to accept that they were weak. And it showed something else, something the Vellery had never seen. It showed Vellery prisoners of war being treated with dignity. Federal sheltered. Given medical care. It showed human soldiers sharing rations with captured enemies, teaching them that surrender did not mean death. "This is Captain Marcus Webb of the Eternal Dawn," the broadcast announced. "To all Vellery forces, your empire has lied to you. They told you we would torture and kill any who surrendered. They told you we were monsters. Look at the truth. We are not your enemies. Your rulers are." The Vellery fleet prepared to fire. 5,000 weapons locked onto 300 targets. The first ship to surrender was a destroyer on the edge of the formation. Its commander had lost 2 sons in the war and had seen enough death. He lowered his weapons and transmitted his capitulation. Then another ship surrendered. Then 10 more. Then 100. The Vellery High Command screamed orders to maintain formation, to destroy the traitors, to fight. But their own soldiers had seen too much. They had watched humanity refuse to break. They had seen that humans offered mercy instead of extinction. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Vellery faced an enemy they could not defeat through strength alone. And their empire crumbled because of it. By the time the battle ended, over 2,000 Vellery ships had surrendered or fled. The Council fleet, the greatest military force in the galaxy, had shattered without a decisive engagement. Captain Webb watched the enemy withdraw from his bridge, his face showing no triumph, only exhaustion. "Lieutenant Chen," he said quietly, "send a message to Ambassador Vasquez. Tell her the path to Keth Prime is open." On the throne world, High Queen Seraphine received the news of her fleet's collapse with silence. Her advisors waited for her fury, for demands for vengeance, for orders to fight to the last warrior. Instead, she asked a question. "Show me their history again. Show me who these creatures really are." 4 hours, she watched. She saw humans rebuilding after earthquakes, after floods, after wars that should have destroyed them. She saw them reaching for stars they could not touch, climbing mountains that served no purpose, crossing oceans in ships made of wood. She saw a species that had spent its entire existence fighting for survival and had become something terrifying in the process. Not terrifying because they were strong. Terrifying because they never, ever gave up. "They called us the masters of the galaxy," Seraphine said softly. "They called them vermin." She rose from her throne. The first time she had ever stood before her advisors as anything other than a conqueror. "Contact the human ambassador. Tell her," she paused, searching for words her species had never needed before. "Tell her I wish to discuss terms." Ambassador Elena Vasquez received the transmission aboard the Eternal Dawn. When her aides asked what humanity should demand, she thought of every human who had died to reach this moment. She thought of New Bison and the Ghost Cats and the persistent predators who had chased the greatest empire in the galaxy until it collapsed from exhaustion. "We demand everything," she said simply, "and we will settle for nothing less." The reckoning had come, and the galaxy would never be the same. 1 year after the declaration of human weakness, the Grand Assembly Hall was reborn. The crystal structure had been rebuilt, larger and more beautiful than before. Light from 1,000 stars passed through its walls, creating patterns that shifted with the movements of the galaxy itself. Representatives from 73 species filled the chamber, more than had ever gathered in one place in recorded history. Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked to the central podium. She was 72 now, her hair fully white, her steps slower than they had been, but her eyes still held the same calm fire that had faced down the Vellery a year ago. The chamber fell silent as she raised her hand. 1 year ago, she began, a representative of the Vellery Empire stood in this hall and declared humanity unfit for membership in the Galactic Council. He called us weak. He called us vermin. He laughed while condemning our children to slavery. She paused, letting the memory settle over the assembly. Today, that same empire no longer exists. Not because we destroyed it. Because its foundations were built on cruelty and fear. When those foundations cracked, everything above them collapsed. In a special section of the hall, the former leaders of the Vellery Empire sat in defendants' chairs. High Queen Seraphine was among them, her once proud posture diminished by months of captivity and the weight of her crimes. The tribunal that would judge them consisted of representatives from every species the Vellery had oppressed for millennia. Mulgary judges who remembered slavery. Thornox witnesses who had watched their forest worlds burn. Cuthir survivors who had lost everything to imperial conquest. Justice would be served. Not human justice alone, but galactic justice. Built on the foundations of what humanity had fought to create. Captain Marcus Webb watched the proceedings from the observation deck, the same deck where everything had begun a year ago. He wore civilian clothes now. His uniform hung in a closet aboard the Eternal Dawn, which was being refitted for its new mission as a peacekeeping vessel. Strange, isn't it? Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood beside him. She was Captain Chen now, commander of the Dawn. A year ago, we were watching them laugh at us. "I remember," Webb said softly. "I also remember thinking that laughter would be expensive for them." "You're really retiring?" "I've spent my whole life fighting, Sarah. First for survival, then for recognition, then for victory." He smiled tiredly. "Someone else can fight for peace. I'm going to teach." The new Galactic Academy had been established on a neutral world, funded by contributions from dozens of species. Young officers from across the galaxy would learn together, building relationships that would prevent future wars. Webb had been asked to lead its first class of cadets. His curriculum would focus on a simple philosophy. Strength is not the absence of weakness. It is the refusal to be defined by it. Far from the halls of power, on a world still scarred by war, Sergeant Major De Jong Beck hammered a nail into a wooden board. He was building a community center for the children of New Bison, on the same ground where he had led his Marines into an impossible battle. His hands, which had killed more enemies than he could count, now shaped toys and furniture for kids who had never known peace. A group of children watched him work, asking endless questions. "Sergeant Beck, is it true you captured a whole spaceship by yourself?" "Not by myself," Beck replied, not looking up from his work. "I had 11 friends helping me. But you killed 100 aliens." He finally stopped, setting down his hammer. The children looked at him with wide eyes, expecting tales of glory. "I did things that needed to be done," he said carefully. "I'm not proud of killing. I'm proud that my friends came home. I'm proud that children like you get to grow up safe." He picked up the hammer again. "Now, who wants to learn how to build something?" Dr. Mina Shin had received offers from a dozen species to lead research initiatives on their home worlds. She had chosen instead to establish a joint medical center where scientists from former enemy nations worked side by side. Her latest project was developing a treatment for a disease that affected Velari children. The same species that had tried to enslave humanity now benefited from human compassion. Some called it foolish. Mina called it progress. "The war is over," she explained to those who questioned her work. "Holding on to hatred serves nothing. If we want the galaxy to change, we have to show them a different way." Her research partner was a Velari scientist named Thrall, cousin to the High Arbiter who had once mocked humanity. Thrall had watched his people's empire crumble and had chosen to build something new from the ashes. "Your people are strange," he told Mina one evening. "You fight like demons but heal like saints." Mina smiled. "We contain multitudes." Lieutenant Hygiene Lee, former music teacher, now led the Galactic Rapid Response Force. Her command included warriors from every species that had fought alongside humanity. They responded to crises, prevented atrocities, and protected those who could not protect themselves. She kept a small music player in her quarters, loaded with recordings of traditional songs from Earth. On quiet nights, she played them and remembered the students she had lost on New Bison. Their names were engraved on a memorial wall in her office. One evening, a young Velari prisoner requested an audience with her. He was barely an adult by his species standards, captured during the war and awaiting transfer to rehabilitation programs. "Commander," he said nervously, "I was taught that humans were weak, that you would break under pressure, that you were inferior to us in every way." Hygiene waited for him to continue. "I watched you fight. I saw your soldiers die rather than surrender. I saw you show mercy to prisoners who expected torture." He lowered his head. "I do not understand how something so soft can be so strong." Hygiene considered her answer carefully. "On our home world, there is a plant called bamboo. It bends in the wind instead of standing rigid. When storms come, strong trees break and fall. But bamboo survives because it adapts." She leaned forward. "Humans are not strong because we cannot be broken. We are strong because being broken does not stop us. We fall and we rise. We hurt and we heal. We lose and we keep fighting." The young Velari absorbed her words in silence. "One day," Hygiene added, "when you return to your people, remember what you learned here. Teach them that strength and kindness are not opposites. They are the same thing, expressed differently." Admiral Sung-Ho Kim did not live to see the peace he had fought to create. He passed away 3 months after the war ended, surrounded by officers from 12 different species who called him mentor and friend. His funeral was attended by beings from across the galaxy. They came to honor a human who had shown them that persistence could overcome any obstacle, that courage could exist in fragile bodies, that wisdom came from experience rather than long life. His final words, recorded before his death, were played at the ceremony. "I was born into a world that thought humanity was alone in the universe. I die knowing we have friends among the stars. That is enough. That is more than I ever dreamed." In the Grand Assembly Hall, the tribunal concluded its proceedings. High Queen Seraphine was sentenced to exile, stripped of all titles and power. Other Velari leaders faced various punishments based on their individual crimes. But the focus was not on punishment. It was on prevention. New laws were established. New protections created. New systems of cooperation built. The galaxy would never again allow one species to dominate others through force alone. As the final session concluded, a disturbance near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A delegation of newcomers had arrived, unexpected and unannounced. They were insectoid beings from a distant arm of the galaxy, their ships having traveled for decades to reach known space. They were large, armored, and visibly aggressive, carrying themselves with the arrogance of beings who had never faced true challenge. Their leader surveyed the diverse assembly with obvious contempt. His eyes settled on the human delegation. "We detect many strong species in this gathering," he clicked. "But what are these tiny creatures? They seem barely capable of independent movement." Silence fell over the hall. Then, slowly, something remarkable happened. Every species in the chamber, from the massive Thornox to the aquatic Mulgary to the energy-based Venari, began to laugh. Not cruel laughter like the Velari had offered a year ago. Warm laughter. Knowing laughter. The laughter of friends sharing an old joke. The newcomers shifted uncomfortably. They had expected fear or submission, not amusement. Ambassador Elena Vasquez rose from her seat, her movement slow but steady. She walked toward the newcomers, her white hair catching the starlight that filtered through the crystal walls. "Welcome to the Galactic Council," she said kindly. "You must be tired from your long journey. Please sit down. Make yourselves comfortable." The newcomer leader looked down at her, confused by the lack of deference. "You did not answer my question, small creature. What is your species? What could you possibly contribute to a gathering of powerful beings?" Vasquez smiled. It was the same smile she had worn when the Velari declared Humanity Week. The same smile she had worn when the galaxy burned. "Sit down, young ones," she said gently. "Let me tell you a story about what happens when you underestimate humans." And so, in a hall rebuilt from the ashes of an empire, a grandmother began to speak. She told of a species that should have died 1,000 times but refused. Of soldiers who strapped explosives to their bodies rather than surrender. Of scientists who turned enemy biology into weapons. Of ordinary people who became extraordinary when pushed to the edge. She told of mercy offered to enemies who expected torture. Of hope given to species who had forgotten what it meant. She told of an empire that laughed at humans and burned because of it. The newcomers listened. And their arrogance slowly faded. Around them, representatives of 73 species nodded along with the story, adding their own memories of the war that had changed everything. When the story was finished, the newcomer leader sat in thoughtful silence. "These humans," he said finally, "they are truly as remarkable as you claim?" Every species in the hall answered at once, a chorus of voices in a dozen languages, all saying the same thing. "Yes. More than you can possibly imagine." Ambassador Vasquez returned to her seat, her work done. Outside the crystal walls, the galaxy turned slowly, filled with stars and species and possibilities. Humanity had proven what they were. Now they would spend the rest of their existence showing the galaxy what they could become. And somewhere in the vast darkness of space, the next challenge was already forming. The next enemy was already watching. But humanity would face it the same way they had faced everything else. Together, unbowed, and absolutely refusing to lose. The galaxy had learned an important lesson. When humans fight, they fight with everything they have. When humans fall, they get back up. And when humans love, they love with the same fierce determination that makes them impossible to defeat. That was the truth the Velari had failed to understand. That was the truth the galaxy would never forget. Humans are not the strongest. They are not the wisest. They are not the oldest or the most technologically advanced. But they are the most stubborn. And sometimes that is enough. 1 year after the war ended, I returned to the Crystal Hall. Not as a supplicant, not as a conqueror, as a guest. The galaxy had changed. The hall had been rebuilt, its walls shimmering with the light of 1,000 stars. Representatives from 73 species filled the chamber, but the seating was different now. No thrones. No frozen smoke. No living quartz carved from conquered worlds. Just chairs. All of them the same height. All of them bolted to the floor at the same distance from the center. I sat in the section once reserved for the Velari. Now it belonged to no one. Now it belonged to everyone. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the podium. She was older now, her hair fully white, her movements slower, but her voice carried the same steady calm that had faced down an empire. She spoke of the war, of the lessons learned, of the future being built. When she finished, the chamber did not applaud. It simply sat in silence, honoring the weight of her words. After the session, I found her standing alone by the crystal wall, looking out at the stars. "Ambassador," I said, "may I ask you something?" She turned. Her eyes were tired but warm. "Of course. What happens now? The war is over. The Velari are defeated. The galaxy is at peace. What comes next?" She looked back at the stars. "The work," she said. "The real work. Building something that lasts. Teaching the next generation that strength and kindness are not opposites. Making sure no species ever has to fight alone again." "That sounds harder than the war." "It is." She smiled. "But we have practice." We stood in silence for a while, watching the light shift through the crystal. Somewhere below us, the new Galactic Academy was holding its first classes. Young officers from a dozen species sat together, learning Webb's philosophy. Strength is not the absence of weakness. It is the refusal to be defined by it. Somewhere on New Bison, Sergeant Major Beck was teaching children how to build. His hands, once instruments of war, now shaped toys and furniture and futures. The kids called him Uncle Beck. They did not know about the boarding action, about the command ship, about the 1,000 enemies who had fallen to his Marines. They knew he made the best kites in the colony. Somewhere in a joint medical center, Dr. Mina Shin was treating a Velari child for a respiratory condition. The child's parents had once commanded the ships that tried to burn her world. Now they thanked her in halting English, their compound eyes wet with tears she had learned to read as gratitude. "Thank you, Doctor," the mother said. "Our son, he would have died without you." Mina simply nodded. She did not say, "Your empire tried to enslave my people. Your soldiers killed my colleagues. Your High Queen declared us vermin." She did not say any of that, because the war was over and the work was healing. Somewhere in a small apartment overlooking the ocean on Earth, Captain Marcus Webb sat in a worn armchair, reading a book. Not a tactical manual, not a diplomatic brief, a novel. He had been a soldier for 30 years. He had fought in every conflict humanity had faced since first contact. Now he was learning what it meant to rest. His daughter, a young woman named Lily who had been born while he was stationed on Velher Station, sat on the floor beside him, drawing. She had never seen combat. She had never lost anyone to war. She knew the Velari only as the beings her father had helped defeat, and she thought of them as sad, not evil. "Dad," she said, holding up her drawing, "this is a Velari. I gave him a flower." Webb looked at the drawing. A 6-limbed creature holding a bright red blossom. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Are they still angry at us?" "No," he said carefully. "Some of them are. But most of them are just trying to live their lives, like us. Maybe someday, you'll visit their world. Maybe you'll make friends." She considered this. "I'd like that." Somewhere in the darkness between stars, the Ghost Fleet had been decommissioned. Commander Yuna Song had accepted a position as head of planetary defense for a colony of former Velari refugees, beings who had opposed the war and fled their empire before it fell. They called themselves the Free Worlds. Yuna called them her responsibility. "You saved my people," the colony's leader told her during their first meeting. "We were enemies. Now we are... what are we?" Yuna looked at the alien before her, a being she had sworn to destroy a year ago. "We are neighbors," she said. "That is enough for now." Somewhere in the Grand Assembly Hall, the tribunal's final verdicts had been delivered. High Queen Seraphine would spend the rest of her life in exile, forbidden from holding power, forced to watch the galaxy rebuild without her. She had accepted her sentence without protest. Before she was taken away, she asked to speak with Ambassador Vasquez. They met in a small room with no windows, no recording devices, no witnesses. Seraphine looked smaller than she had on her throne, diminished, human in her fragility. "I want to understand," the former queen said. "Why did you show mercy? We would not have shown it to you." Vasquez considered the question. Because mercy is not weakness. It is the choice to break the cycle. Your empire ruled through fear. Fear creates enemies. Mercy creates something else. What? Possibility. Seraphine said nothing. She simply nodded and let the guards lead her away. Perhaps she understood. Perhaps she would spend her exile thinking about the possibility. Perhaps that was enough. That evening, I sat in the observation deck of the Eternal Dawn, watching the stars. The ship was being refitted for its new mission, a peacekeeping vessel, not a warship. Its weapons had been removed. Its hull had been repainted from military gray to diplomatic white. But its engines were the same. Its crew was mostly the same. And its spirit was unchanged. Captain Sarah Chun found me there. She was young to command a ship of this size, but she had earned it, through blood, through tears, through refusing to break when breaking would have been easier. "Ambassador," she said, "we're about to depart. Did you want to say goodbye to anyone?" I thought about the people I had met in the past year. The soldiers. The diplomats. The aliens who had become friends. The enemies who had become neighbors. "I already did," I said. She nodded. "Then let's go home." The ship lifted from the station, sliding through the crystal walls into open space. Behind us, the Grand Assembly Hall grew smaller, a frozen tear floating in the darkness, rebuilt from the ashes of empire. Ahead of us, Earth waited. Blue and green and alive, full of people who had no idea how close they had come to losing everything. They would never know. That was our job. To keep the darkness at bay so they could live their ordinary lives, argue about small things, love each other, raise children, grow old. The work, as Ambassador Vasquez had said, was not the war. The work was what came after. The work was building something worth protecting. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. The engines hummed. The stars stretched into lines of light. Somewhere behind me, the galaxy was learning to heal. Somewhere ahead, my mother was waiting. She had promised to make jollof rice, the same recipe her mother had taught her, the same recipe that had fed generations of our family through wars and famines and peace. I thought about the Crystal Hall, the laughter, the declaration of weakness, the fire that had spread across the galaxy and changed everything. I thought about a grandmother who had stood before an empire and refused to kneel, a soldier who had traded his uniform for a hammer, a doctor who healed her former enemies, a queen who had learned, too late, that strength without mercy is just tyranny. And I thought about the newcomers who would come, eventually. The next threat. The next challenge. The next species that looked at humanity and saw weakness. They would learn. They always learned. The ship jumped to fold space. The stars steadied. I opened my eyes and looked out at the infinite dark. Somewhere out there, the galaxy was still spinning. Still arguing. Still building. Still healing. And somewhere on a small blue planet, a pot of rice was simmering on a stove, and a mother was waiting for her daughter to come home. That was enough. That was everything. I smiled. The ship hummed. The stars held their light. And I went home.